Welcome to an episode of the podcast Art Insiders New York. My name is Anders Holst. The theme of the podcast is New York, with a focus on behind-the-scenes conversation with fascinating people who are making an impact in the world of art, design, and architecture. SOHO is one of the most iconic neighborhoods in Manhattan, much beloved by both New Yorkers and tourists, with its cobblestone streets, unique collection of cast iron buildings, quaint cafes, and restaurants. It is the creative and dynamic vibe that draws people here from around the world, a sophisticated and stylish blend of fashion, art, and business. It's hard to imagine that SOHO once was an industrial neighborhood that went from being called Hell's 100 Acres and should be demolished to the best place to live in Manhattan, according to the New York Times in the 1970s. Here to share the fascinating and dramatic story of how SOHO became SOHO is our guest Aaron Skhuda, the author of Lofts of SOHO, Gentrification, Art and Industry in New York. Aaron received his PhD from the University of Chicago and is the project manager of the Princeton-Mellon Initiative in Architecture, Urbanism and the Humanities. You have written a wonderful book, I have to say, a great book about SOHO that really makes the history of this place come alive in a wonderful and dramatic way. So many transitions in this process, and it's interesting to live in the middle of it every day.
It is a book that came out of my PhD dissertation, as is the case for most historians. You write you're in graduate school, you write a dissertation, and the idea is if you want to continue your career, you turn it into a book. Yeah. I mean, I actually did go to graduate school with the idea of studying the history of gentrification. It's something now, there's kind of a small portion of a generation of historians kind of writing these histories. I have a colleague colleagues I'm close with. One wrote a book about brownstone Brooklyn. The other one wrote a book about Harlem. But I went to graduate school trying to think about, well, how might I study the early days of what we might call gentrification? And I was actually just reading a book after my first year of graduate school, which was about the summer of New York, the summer of 1977 in New York, considered by many to be sort of the low point in New York's 20th century history. It was the summer of Sam, it was the blackout riots that affected so much of the city. And it was also this tumultuous year for the Yankees with Reggie Jackson feuding with Billy Martin. That was actually the center of the book. I am a baseball fan myself. But there's two pages actually about your neighbor up Broadway. It was 2 pages about Dean and DeLuca. It was the year that Dean and DeLuca opened. And there was this moment when the book said, hey, all these sort of not so great things are happening in New York. And there's this moment when this shop opens that for some people sort of signaled the end of a certain era of SOHO. The neighborhood had kind of arrived to the point that this gourmet grocery store opened. And Dean and DeLuca's history is actually quite interesting and complicated, but to me that sort of signaled this productive contradiction. Like, how do you get a store like Dean and DeLuca opening up in I forget whether it's 1976 or 77, but opening up right at the time where New York was going through some of its lowest points. It was the time of the near bankruptcy, the emergency fiscal manager that came in. So how do you get the end of a kind of early era of gentrification at a time when the city is struggling so much? And that was really when I began to ask this question and investigate, went back to write a history of SOHO. Certainly it's a neighborhood that's been studied by academics, but not really in the sort of the way that a historian would study it, let's say.
Very interesting. So how would you define SOHO?
A surprisingly complicated question. I mean, you could do what urban planners at once did and essentially say, well, the area from West Broadway to Broadway, Houston to Canal Street, sort of constitutes the SOHO district, right? There's a historic district that has been expanded, but roughly that's at its core. One could also say that really what defines SOHO is the cast iron architecture, this particular legacy of the 19th century that shaped its industrial past, its rise as an artist colony, and certainly shapes the very space that we're talking in today. But SOHO is also this idea, right, that it stands in for something more. Every once in a while I talk to someone like, do you mean the one in Britain or the one in New York? Well, the one in New York. But there's this nomenclature that is developed that the podcast 99% Invisible called an acroname. Some places like Financial District, FIDI, the South Bronx can be Sobro. We have Dumbo over in Brooklyn. There's this sense that SOHO now means something. It means a particular kind of urban redevelopments that's perhaps led by artists. It's oftentimes in a formerly industrial area, or maybe just has some sort of gritty artistic chic to go along with the kind of the redevelopment of the area.
Yeah.
So Soho can mean a lot of things.
Yeah, the embourgement. I
Yes.
saw that. That's a very elegant term, probably borrowed from the French, which means like gentrification, right? In a more glamorous way.
Something, yes, becoming more bourgeois, more stable.
So let's start at the beginning then. So this was like agricultural land basically in the 1800s?
Yes, in the 17th century, like all Manhattan, it was agricultural land, and Soho, in a sense, its early years. I mean, I call it Soho, but that in itself is there was no Houston streets. It wasn't south of anything, but this part of Lower Manhattan sort of underwent a similar process that the rest of the island did, where initially everyone was kind of all clumped together at the southern tip of the island, and then first the wealthier people want to get away from the sort of smells and the noise and congestion of everything that was happening in New York, so they moved north. So right in the 1820s, Soho was among the kind of wealthier residential areas of the city. But it sort of reminds me of the kind of classic diagram of Robert Park and Ernest Burgess, this sociologist at the University of Chicago in the 1920s, who theorized that cities moved kind of in this concentric ring model through a process of invasion and its succession, where essentially whoever can move out does, but eventually the next inner rung moves out and takes over the one that moved out first. So first you have residences, and then you had commerce. So in the 1820s, this area was residential. In the 1850s, it became more profitable for commercial establishments to locate in this area. So the Lord and Taylor's, Tiffany's, some of these major retailers had their first homes in their first buildings in what is now Soho. But by the 1860s, industrial uses, the industry moved further and further up Manhattan, pushing commerce out, pushing residents out. And by the 1860s is when you start beginning the era that at least gives us the current built environment of Soho. That's when the industrial loft comes into being. That's when dry goods firms, kind of manufacturers, warehousers built these 4 to 6 story cast iron structures, to house industrial businesses, but ones because of the sort of the complicated history of the neighborhood, remain to this day.
I see. So what strikes me often when I'm here is the beautiful architecture and the cast iron buildings, and you do talk about that in your book, and it's inspired by French and Italian neoclassical. But what explains that it's so concentrated here, that there's so many buildings that are so beautiful here rather than in any other place?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, like a lot of things, it's a bit of circumstance. It was this. You could consider the loft a bit of a transitional structure, right? It's something that required a certain amount of industrial production and prefabrication, but it predates the skyscraper. So you had in this period of time new techniques in kind of iron foundries that would allow these, what looked like very beautiful facades are actually prefabricated pieces of iron, right? They're built in factories, some in New York, some as far away as Alabama, but they're iron pieces that were constructed, shipped here and could be sort of slapped on the side of a building. And in that, in the late 19th century, imagine this was roughly the time of the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago. It was a period where neoclassicism was in vogue, rather ornate, ornate structures. So you had, when industry sort of crept north from Lower Manhattan to this particular point in the city was when you had this confluence of factors, iron prefabrication, neoclassicism being in vogue. So you get the loft, right? But only a few years later, there are more techniques. Steel production becomes the predominant building type. You don't have what are essentially rather dangerous cast iron columns holding up the building.
Yeah.
And neoclassicism falls out of favor. Not too many years later, you have the beginnings of the period of modernism and the international style. And sort of the fussiness of the loft falls out of favor.
So it's unclear to me. So you have the architecture and you have the loft, and that was designed for residential first, or was it sort of industry moving into residential? Still, the loft is pretty. I mean, we're sitting in a room here in a building that used to be manufacturers of harmonicas. So was that the case, that it was residential first and then the industry moved in?
Well, it was this area was residential, but those structures have, with rare exceptions, have long since been torn down. So it was a residential area, but then the residential structures were torn down, and industrial concerns or investors, built these loft structures, which were not designed for residences at all. The ground floors oftentimes were designed as showrooms, or as if some of the few lofts that haven't been completely renovated. One that the Daya Foundation owns over on West Broadway was a kind of tobacco sales floor, a place where people come and buy wholesale. So the first or second floors were maybe designed as commercial spaces, but the upper floors are almost entirely industrials. They were designed for light manufacturing, or as time went on, increasingly heavier manufacturing, or warehousing, or primarily for sort of dry good and wholesaling firms.
So what explains the concentration here was that there was a lot of different driving forces that really made it concentrate on this. Going back a little bit, I noted in your book here that it was commercial here. So it was like Times Square down here. You say Gotham's golden mile of whoredom, which was like maybe the tail end of Times Square then.
It was, and my colleague, actually my editor, Timothy Guilfoyle, wrote a great book about this. But it was the place, kind of the center of prostitution in the city, and especially in the 1850s. It kind of had this dual role. Like, one is it was a very high-end shopping district, as I mentioned, Tiffany's, Lord & Taylor's, other sort of high-end retailers of the day located here. But at night, it was the place where people came for for that sort of activity. Eventually, that sort of gets dispersed throughout the city, but that was its nature in the 1850s. But again, like that predates the loft era. Like, a lot of the loft buildings replaced what was the original homes of Tiffany and Lord & Taylor.
So then you move on to the sort of the industrial part of it then at 1890, 1950 or something like that. So what happened here? So people moved out, the department stores moved out, the hotel closed, and...
They moved out, and the industrial era really begins. So somewhere, long era, but the 1860s to the 1890s, the area becomes more and more industrial. But by the turn of the 20th century, the built environment of SOHO is essentially, with few exceptions, looked like what it looks like today. And there is this period of kind of stasis. You have, dry goods wholesaling, light manufacturing, some type of garment work. That was really what made up SOHO's industrial sector. And the area provided jobs for quite a few people. There are businesses that remained in the area for decades, making modest profits. But it wasn't, let's say, the most dynamic sector of New York's economy. And by World War II, the neighborhood was very similar to what it was at 1900.
Yeah, I was very fascinated by, in your book you write about the fact that New York never really had an industrial base. It was not like Detroit. I mean, it's been more of a trading and service-oriented city.
It had quite a robust industrial base. I think just because of the sheer size of New York, it was among the nation's largest industrial centers. But I think what differs, you think about the kind of older American cities, Philadelphia, New York, Boston, they were industrial centers, but they were rather diverse ones, right? Their industrial base sort of comes from their earlier history as a place where agricultural goods came in from the surrounding areas, were packaged for shipments, were it's where people came together for trade, and then you have shipbuilding, then you have warehousing, and then from there you start to get sort of the base of an industrial city. The Pittsburghs and Detroits, you have a confluence of factors that made them essentially one industry towns. Pittsburgh, it's the major industrialists, but also the availability of coal from the Monongahela Valley. In Detroit, you have a relatively flat area with good access to water transportation through the Great Lakes, but you have someone, Henry Ford, essentially remaking the city in his own image.
Yeah.
So New York had an industrial base, but it was never that one industry town.
So then you talk about in the book Hell's 100 Acres. Mm-hmm. So that was the tail end of the industrial phase, one could say, here in Soho.
Right. I mean, lofts were high-tech industrial structures for the late 19th century. Yeah. But for the mid-20th centuries, there were some challenges, right? I mean, the space we're in now is vast for a residence, but if you imagine operating a small factory in a space that's maybe 5,000 square feet, that becomes challenging, particularly if you have a cast iron column in the middle of that space that's holding up the entire structure. So particularly after World War II, when more goods are being moved by truck over the interstate highway system, you start to get industrial production moving in a very horizontal direction. Power is cheaper, conveyor belts are put into use. There's because there are more efficiencies that allow industrial production to happen on one floor in a streamlined way, where you go from raw materials on one end to a product on the other that can be loaded onto a truck. So Soho is really at a disadvantage for that type of manufacturing. We don't have, there's no room for horizontal spaces. There's no big freight rail line where you can load goods onto, and driving an 18-wheeler down a street in Soho is a nightmare. Yeah. So you have more and more marginal industrial businesses kind of hanging on in Soho, and more vacancies. And that's when you start to have artists begin to move in.
I see. So the artists, they are moving in slowly here in the beginning of the 60s and 70s. But before then, there was some, or rather in parallel, there was a lot of urban renewal initiatives. And we had this, the Lower Manhattan Expressway, designed by Moses, the city planner.
Yeah, and there, you mentioned Hell's 100 Acres. I mean, this was not an area of the city that was particularly valued. There were old buildings, they were considered rather marginal, and one of the other phrases that planners or observers would use for this area is the valley, because you look one way, you see the high-rises of Lower Manhattan, you look at the other way, you see the high-rises of Midtown. Yeah. The area in between was both sort of a literal and an economic valley, right? It wasn't seen as particularly productive. And during this era, during the period from roughly the 1920s to the 1930s, urban planners, architects, policymakers, there was a general consensus among these groups that the best thing to do with unproductive areas of the city were to sort of tear them down, raise the area if possible, and start anew. So, I mentioned my parents lived in the Silver Towers. That was part of the Washington Square Southeast Urban Development Project. It was something that New York's City Planning Commission, Robert Moses, New York University, came together using federal money and city coordination, to buy and tear down a roughly 9-block area of structures, a lot of them resembling Soho lofts, some sort of smaller residential structures, and building I guess what is now 5 high-rise apartment buildings. So that was one plan. That was a project that affected the area all the way up to Houston Street. And there were plans in the early 1960s to tear down the rest of what is now Soho and build similar middle-income housing projects. On the other hand, from roughly the 1920s to about 1970s, there were plans to connect the Holland Tunnel to the Williamsburg Bridge through a multiple-lane highway across Broome Street, which was known as the Lower Manhattan Expressway. This was sort of for reasons of expense and political will. These were among the last projects of the Robert Moses era of highway construction, none of which were ever built. We have lots of highways in New York, relatively speaking, but none of them cross Manhattan. But one of the plans was for one of them to happen, just outside your window here. It is something where the idea of the Lower Manhattan Expressway hung over the neighborhood for a period of decades, but the physical changes never really took place.
So on the one hand side, you have Robert Moses and the establishment and the real estate. So who was on the other side?
There was a coalition of coalition of of residents and politicians against the against the Lower Manhattan Expressway. I mean, so much of this history in New York is told through the sort of clashes between Robert Moses on one hand and Jane Jacobs on the other. And Jane Jacobs was part of the committee to stop the Lower Manhattan Expressway. There was also, because there were no residents in Soho, you didn't hear as many protests from the business community, but certainly the residents and churches in Little Italy were kind of standing up against the highway. And also, eventually, later in the game, there was a group of artists who came out, and they founded a group called Artists Against the Expressway to highlight what the damage that would be done to New York's art community based on this highway. But for a large part, I mean, certainly the protests against this highway were important, and ultimately, I think they played a critical role in stopping the construction. But there were other factors. I mean, simply the time, that building highways in other parts of New York was less expensive. It was easier. I mean, this is Manhattan. It's the most built-up area of the city, and there's a reason that no highway was ever built across the entire island. I mean, and that's not just because of who lived in Soho or who worked in Soho. The same could be said for 34th Street or 125th Street, where there were other plans to create limited access highways.
Yeah. So Jane Jacobs, I often say that she should have a statue of her at the Soho Plaza, the square over there, where they just actually renovated the square. It looks pretty damn good. But is she, or is it there? It's more complicated than that, because I noticed in your book Chester Rapkin's study from 1963 about basically that this was a very important industrial zone and needed to be preserved as one.
Right. Chester Rapkin at least has a plaque a few blocks from here, I believe on Prince Street, close to West Broadway. But yeah, Chester Rapkin, Soho is an interesting case because, yes, Robert Moses is part of the story, Jane Jacobs is part of the story, but there isn't this sort of big hero or villain in this multi-decade development. But Chester Rapkin is as close as you get, and Chester Rapkin is an urban planning professor. He used to work in the same building that I do at Princeton and the School of Architecture. At that time, he wasn't at Princeton, I believe he was at Penn, but so when there was this idea floated to build a middle-income housing development in what is now Soho, the City Planning Commission hired Chester Rapkin to undertake a study of the area. And he went. He and a team of researchers went around, interviewed business owners, took inventories of workers, and we made this rather persuasive argument. Remember, this is 1963, really the height of the civil rights movement, that Soho was critical. Although the businesses were not particularly fancy, they weren't super profitable, but they were chugging along, and they had a particular role to play in providing jobs for blue-collar workers in the city, particularly African American and Puerto Rican residents of New York. And that argument was persuasive, and because of that, there weren't too many really advanced plans, but that pretty much ended any momentum for tearing down Soho and creating an urban renewal project there.
And then I understand the problem was that there was a plan in place, but there was no funding coming in to make sure that this plan could then have a possibility of creating something special. Is that correct?
There was no specific funding in place, but at that period of time, it wasn't such a it wouldn't have been so difficult for a project, to purchase these beautiful lofts through eminent domain and build something new there.
Yeah, but it didn't really happen. The industrial sort of era went down more or less, and then you have the artists coming in.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's a story. The same thing with the Lower Manhattan Expressway. There's enough problems to create a space for someone to do something new, but there's enough sort of going for the area that no one wants to take a really drastic step to change things. So, Rapkin's report and, the pushback and the sort of general exhaustion with highway building in New York, allows for industry to sort of keep going. But it's not a particularly robust industrial sector, and during the early 1960s, there are quite a few vacancies here. And so most of the buildings in Soho are owned by maybe an individual owner or a family, and they need to bring in rent. And it's unclear who the first person was. I mean, the idea of artists living in industrial lofts is something that took place kind of scattered throughout the city, whether it's in Conti's Slip, which is eventually became the site of the World Trade Center, or the Fur District in the 1920s. Artists knew that they were kind of big unpartitioned spaces that they could use as studios, and more they noticed that there were vacancies in Soho. So the artists begin to come into the area as the industrial era, it takes 20 or 30 years, is beginning to wind down.
And then, of course, as you noted in the book, the most exciting place to live, according to New York Times, in 1974. So that went fast, from the 50s to the 70s. So what explains that? People are attracted by this art? They're attracted by the community? They're attracted about what's happening here?
Yeah, and that's an important question. I mean, one of the things I always was fascinated with is this idea of like why do artist communities, why do gallery districts have a draw? We have this idea now, whether it's Richard Florida's idea of the creative class or the National Endowment for the Arts, which still funds projects around this notion of creative placemaking. Like, why do artist communities and the arts have this role to play in the city? And as you note, from Hell's 100 Acres in 1962 to the most exciting place to live in the city in 1974, like what happened in those 12 years? And there's a few things happen. Like one is artists create Soho artists create what we now know as the residential loft. They can through borrowed money and shared labor, turned these pretty scruffy industrial spaces into rather simple but very attractive apartments, ones that look like nothing else in the city. Because of the availability of commercial space and industrial loft space in the same neighborhood, art galleries begin to open in the area. And for the first time, you have a neighborhood in New York where artist residences and art galleries are sharing the same space, or creates this vibrant community where there are openings, there are performances. There's just a lot going on that began to draw people down to Soho. But also there was a parallel process of legalization. Living in a loft was illegal in the 1960s, and artists really had to come together and lobby city officials, urban planners to change some of the regulations to make it so they wouldn't risk eviction for living in a loft. And that process regularized the residences in the area, but also attracted more and more attention to the neighborhood and helped it gain this reputation as an exciting place to live.
A couple of important dates here. The Landmark Historic District in 1973 and the 1982 Loft Law that made living here legal, I guess. In this building we have AIR. You have to be an artist in residence. So we still are struggling with these restrictions or regulations from this era, basically.
Right. Yeah, so that goes back to an early compromise that was made in 1964. There was, in 1961, there's a series of fires in Soho, and the fire department and the building department in the city go around to different lofts, think they're going to be just inspecting industrial businesses and start to find people living in these areas. There's no sense that artists are causing fires, but for city officials in charge of enforcing the law and making sure people are safe, they started to get really concerned and push to evict these illegal tenants. And so artists begin to organize. They form a group called the Artist Tenants Association. And the first kind of compromise policy that's passed in 1974 is called AIR, Artist in Residence. This is, artists could register for the city, register with the city, put a sign outside their loft that said Artist in Residence, and the fire department would sort of know who to come and rescue if need be. Eventually, that idea gets put into the city zoning code in 1971, and a special light industrial district is created in Soho by which one who is kind of a certified artist can live in this neighborhood in a loft. In fact, it's still the one place in the city where that has this special requirement. So it could be, I haven't looked at the map, but I'm guessing that your building, it's still in the zoning code that one has to go in front of the City Department of Cultural Affairs and get certified as an artist to live in this structure. Eventually, the Loft Law, which was passed in 1982, and some of the amendments to the law allow people to sort of be grandfathered in if they're not a certified artist, but they lived in Soho for 15 years. They're not going to be evicted under this policy. But it still creates this very sort of diverse and frankly, problematic on sometimes legal landscape for the neighborhood. it is, it's something Carl Weisbrod, who was the first chair of the Loft board, when I interviewed him for the book, just sort of said it's a bizarre policy. I mean, why, I'm all for creating affordable spaces to live for artists, and I'm sure many are. But the idea of the city of New York judging who is an artist and who's not, it seems like it's, not one to cry government overreach, but that sounds like probably not something we want our governments being in the business.
So this is something that's totally unique to SOHO. This type of zoning with this type of restrictions.
Yeah, as far as I know, yes. I know of no other similar examples. For a whole district to have a special artist zoning.
Yeah. So this was a very dynamic artist community then in the 70s and 80s. And I have some friends who lived here, one Swedish painter, and he said he had more people coming to his opening than Rauschenberg had at the time, and he was very proud of that. Things have changed since then, of course. But what happened there? So the artists were here, they were sort of mixing into the community, and it was the most attractive place to live, according to New York Times. And what happened the next step, the next transition?
Yeah, well, I think what was so fascinating, and I think really just unique about SOHO, is the artists were the community. I mean, when I talked to longtime residents of the neighborhood, they would, reminisce about what would happen on the weekends and after 5 o'clock on weekdays in the neighborhood, because during the day it was still an industrial area. There were workers coming and going, there were products sort of moving, but the area would really just clear out completely at night, and residents would see on the street was an artist, was a member of the community. So you'd get to know your neighbors, you'd find out who was working on what. And after 1968, when galleries began opening in SOHO, and more after 1970, when commercial galleries from Midtown started moving here, you'd find out about who was having an opening, who's having what show, and there was this kind of mutually supportive community, one where people were crossing genres with regularity, because you would get to know the painter, the musician, or the dancer kind of living all around you. So I think it was that milieu that starts to then attract people from maybe outside of the artist community. It's hard because it was illegal, you don't have records, but my sense is like before the 1970, there weren't too many non-artists living in the area. But after 68 and 70, when galleries start coming here, when businesses start to open to cater to gallery visitors that have more restaurants, more shops, and then once George McCunis, the Fluxus artist, comes up with this idea of turning loft buildings into cooperatives that people could own, that really begins a new phase in the neighborhood's history.
Very interesting. And he is is it Worcester and Canal?
Yeah, there's one of the...
There's a plaque there, and that's the original building where he had this.
Yeah, 151 Broadway, West Broadway was one of them.
What worked for SOHO then could work in other places, and there are some theories about this, as you were talking about earlier, that sort of artist-driven urban development. But the situation here in SOHO is pretty unique, though. I mean, you cannot really recreate all those various things. I think that you mentioned in the book the importance of crisis and of change, because there were so many simultaneous changes that really created this. What do you think of that theory of is that something you can apply to all cities to renew the urban centers?
Well, I think you can answer that question in a variety of ways. I mean, one thing that's clear is that there are neighborhoods, it's weird to sort of personify a neighborhood, but there are neighborhoods across the country, if not the world, that seek to emulate SOHO. I believe I was in Stockholm and there was a SOFO, and it was even south of, I forget the name of the street, but that...
Folkungagatan.
Exactly, yes, I do remember that. I took a little picture, of course. But the idea that even, you import an English word, create an acronym that signals that there's something about this neighborhood that is following in the footsteps of SOHO, whether it's certain type of chic, whether it's artists, whether it's kind of an industrial landscape. But I mean, it's unclear as to all of these maybe even hundreds of neighborhoods worldwide that now have a SOHO type name, what connection, if any, they have to the original SOHO. I mean, there are some parts of what happened here that were clearly exportable in one way or the other. The idea of converting industrial space, particularly light industrial space, warehouses, to residences on a wide scale. That's something you now see everywhere, whether it's, old industrial buildings converted into loft apartments, or even newly built residential structures that emulate the sort of shape and feel of a SOHO industrial loft. That has certainly been sort of exported. The idea that like a gallery district could spark other types of commercial activity. I mean, certainly I lived in Pittsburgh for several years. There was a Penn Avenue Arts District. They would have gallery crawls. That was one of the ways that the sort of business owners or kind of city representatives of that area worked to kind of bring people to the neighborhood. And there's also this general notion that artists have a particular role to play, especially in post-industrial cities or post-industrial neighborhoods. And that's something that I think has been a benefit to artists, but also, a bit of a burden. I think that it's very easy to sort of instrumentalize artists and instrumentalize the arts in a way that doesn't take artists and their own needs and their own challenges seriously.
So the artists finally moved out, more or less. I mean, there's some galleries left here, but not that many, actually.
Yeah, some galleries have moved, and many artists left. Some are certainly still here. I mean, there are folks who are living in SoHo who bought their lofts for $50,000 or $100,000 in 1968, and there was also if a cooperative had the foresight to actually hang on to their ground floor retail space, a lot of times the cooperative can use the rent on the ground floor retail space to subsidize the building maintenance, allowing an artist who maybe who doesn't have a lot of income these days to continue living in a SoHo loft. So there are some artists who are still here. Certainly, my research tails off in around 1982, and by that area, certainly there are people getting priced out, particularly renters. There's another generation of sort of lower Manhattan artists who come to prominence in the early to mid 80s. But certainly, the art world sort of moved on, certainly by the mid or late 1980s. There are other areas, the art world is in many ways sort of moves in generations. You had, maybe there was a group of painters and performance artists and dancers who use SoHo as their home base, but the sort of next generation doesn't want to try to cram in next to, the people they're trying to, who inspired their work, but they also kind of want to break away from a little bit. So, the East Village becomes one of the next centers. You have, Williamsburg a few years after that, and the art world is just sort of continuing to move.
And now, and many of them moved to Chelsea, and now Chelsea with the Hudson Yard and the High Line, everything is probably going to be too expensive for all the galleries. So now they have to move again somewhere.
Yeah, I mean, they've I think a lot of them were able to buy spaces. These sort of have, it's this continuing, real estate luck or foresight. If a gallery bought their loft in SoHo in 1968 and they sold it then in 1990 and bought a space in Chelsea a couple years later and they can sell it in 2018, one can sort of continue kind of using that real estate income to subsidize one's art sales. But yeah, the spaces in Chelsea that under the High Line are in many ways sort of larger analogs to SoHo lofts. They're industrial spaces, high ceilinged, unpartitioned, but they're just bigger and sort of are more fitting to successful galleries who have continued to be part of the art world since the 1960s.
So interestingly enough, we are then after 1990, basically we're back in retailing. We're back in the commercial. So now it's like the retailing haven here for everybody comes to SoHo to shop, and it's as you said and I mentioned before, in the daytime there are lots of people here, and at nighttime it's totally empty. And you can also see the signs. There's a lot of retailing spaces up for lease. So are we going through the next transition? Do you have any ideas on where that's going to take us?
It's a good question. I mean, SoHo, since the 1980s there's been a few other developments, right? I mean, there's here on Broadway, these are where some of the larger lofts were constructed. They were the ones that were more, better suited to industrial production for longer. So there's sort of the smaller lofts get taken over by artists and galleries first, and then it's not until much later that the larger lofts sort of go that way. So yeah, you had, I believe, starting in the 1990s, I'm a little shaky on this, larger retail spaces being leased along Broadway and being the major shopping district. You also, the large unpartitioned spaces also seem to fit really well with the sort of architecture of the tech startup and the sort of creative businesses. So that's another kind of industry that's in Soho. But I think this is a big question that everyone interested in or living in urban spaces or suburban spaces is really thinking about for the future. What if retail is struggling? Large flagship stores with a lot of square footage in New York are incredibly expensive to maintain, and they're clearly struggling. So what those spaces will become is an open question. Certainly, New York could use some more housing, could use some more nonprofit artist spaces, but I always plead ignorance as a historian. I don't know what the future holds.
Wonderful. Well, again, Aaron, thank you so much for the book that you have written, which I find very, very interesting and enlightening, and make, as I said before, the history of Soho come alive in a wonderful way. And thank you so much for participating in this podcast.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
This is Art Insiders New York, and my name is Anders Holst. Thank you for listening, and be sure to visit artinsidersnewyork.com to join the conversation, access show notes, and subscribe to the podcast. If you enjoyed this episode of Art Insiders New York, head over to iTunes to subscribe, rate, and leave a review. It's very much appreciated. Thank you. This episode was produced by UOM LLC, copyright 2019.